The fourth turning, what are the main concepts? What did I learn from it? And should you read it? In this book review, we will find out. Hi, my name is Johannes Niari. I'm a strategy consultant, and in this video, I want to do a book review of The Fourth Turning. This book was recommended to me by a friend and mentor 1 or 2 years ago. And he said, Johannes, we have troubled times ahead. So if you want to understand where we come from, where we are at the moment, and where we're going in the future, then you definitely need to read this book. And today I want to do a book summary. So I will talk a little bit about the main content of the book. I will talk about some key concepts. And I will also talk about if you should invest the time and money to read the book. So with that being said, let's jump directly into it. Let's jump into the book. And first I want to talk about a little bit of the background of the book. So the book was written and published in 1997, so it's quite old, we have to say. It was written by William Strauss and Neil Howe, and the background of these two gentlemen is that they are historians, authors, and demographers. So basically, they wrote a lot of books. I think Neil Howe studied in Yale. Both are historians, and they wrote plenty of books, and they really studied American history. They also studied, I think, or the history of other cultures as well, but they had a strong focus on the American history. And The Fourth Turning is one of their, well-known books that many people know, especially people in politics and the historical world. So what I want to do now is to talk about the main content of the book, to give you an idea what the goal of the book is and how the book is structured. So the main goal of the book is, that it studies the American history of the past 500 years. It also analyzes repeating cycles, and it makes predictions about future developments. And this is pretty cool because, it's really an in-depth review of, 500 years of American history. It really tries to identify different cycles that we see, demographic cycles, but also economic and social cycles as well. And then they make predictions what that means for the future. Of course, if we talk about such frameworks, if we talk about cycles, then we always have to understand that this, of course, is a very simplified version of very complex social, economical dynamics. But nevertheless, I think the frameworks and the concepts that they propose in the book are really helpful, to kind of structure your thoughts and to kind of understand the cycles that we are in. And I think, the best thing about the book is the following. If we talk about the present, if we talk about, all the stuff that's going on, like, wars in Ukraine, then COVID crisis that we recently had, then now the stock market crash. So many things that come together. Sometimes it's really difficult because, the only view that we have is at the present. And what this book does is it takes everything into a broader context of historical developments. And I think this is always very useful in order to understand where we are going, because there's a saying, if you want to predict the future, you have to study the past. And this is exactly what this book does. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the book. So the book has 3 parts, and in the first part, the book lays out all the theoretical concepts that they talk about throughout the book. Then in the second part, the turnings, they really give detailed examples, historical examples, and really try to bring the evidence or like the illustration of the concepts that they discussed in the first chapter. And then in the last chapter and last part, they talk about how to prepare for the future. So this means in the first part, in the seasons, they talk about seasons of time. So they talk about historical cycles. They call it saeculum, and they talk about the main themes that you had in the American history. Then they also talk about seasons of life. So this means life cycles. So life cycles of human beings, like childhood, adulthood, and elderhood. They also talk about chapters of history. These are the turnings within the saeculums. We talk about that in a second as well. And they also talk about so-called great champions. And these are people who play an important role, especially in the turning of a crisis, where they influence history and really help to solve certain issues. Then in part 2, in the turnings, they provide a lot of detail about the first turning, second turning, third, fourth turning. We talk about that in a second, and make a prophecy, so a prediction about the future. This is where really, all the historical details are mapped out. And then in the preparations, they talk about how you can prepare for what is coming. So this is the rough structure. And what I want to do now is to talk about 3 highlight concepts that I think are really important in this book, and that hopefully give you a better idea what the book is about. So the first concept I want to talk about, and that which is one of the main core concepts of the books, is the concept of so-called turnings. So they studied the past and they identified so-called saeculums. And these are broader areas in the American history where you have a certain, social economic system. So this means that, for example, the Great Power Saeculum, it started with the reconstruction of the Gilded Age. So this was 1865, so roughly the start of industrialization, and it ended with the Great Depression and World War. And this was one saeculum. Then they had in history many other saeculums as well, and the saeculum that you probably know the best is the current one. So the last saeculum ended with a crisis with the Great Depression and the World War. Then it started with the American High in the 40s and 60s, and this is what they call the first turning. And you can imagine that, or illustrate it or remember it like you would remember seasons in a year. And this is typically the spring of a new saeculum. And this is where the situation where a current crisis like World War II was resolved, and this is where a new paradigm starts to grow again. And this is the spring, and this was the American High in the 40s to 60s. Then you had the consciousness revolution. This is the so-called summer. So this is where this new paradigm grows, where you also have increasing prosperity, where you have increasing wealth. This is especially what we saw in the 60s to 80s in America. Then the third turning, this is the autumn. This would be the unraveling. This where, for example, the culture wars in the 80s up until now the 2000, I would say 8 with the financial crisis. And then we have the millennial crisis from the 2000s probably up until 2030. And this would be the winter. So the important thing to understand is that every saeculum, so this lasts roughly 100 years, can be divided in 4 phases: the spring, then the summer, the autumn, and the winter. I think this is the important key takeaway here. And what's important to understand is that you have these cycles over and over again throughout history. And the reason is, based on social dynamics, social economic dynamics that you have, that it's very normal that you have a system that you evolve the system up until there is a huge conflict that you need to resolve, and then a new evolution of the same system or a completely new system comes in place. And it's important to understand, and this is what the book does really, really well, that you have these kind of cycles throughout history again and again. Then the second concept I want to talk about is the characterization of these cycles. So you have the first turning, the second turning, third, and the fourth, so the spring to winter. And each season, each turning can be characterized by certain traits. And I don't want to go into all the details here. You can look that up yourself. But it's important to understand that each turning has a certain characteristic. To make it simple, the first turning, for example, this was after the World War II in America. This is typically a period where you come from a crisis that you had to resolve as a generation. Then you look very, very positively into the future because you have a new system in place. Everyone is very optimistic. You remember probably in the 40s to 60s where we had John F. Kennedy, proclaiming that we would go the Americans would go to the moon. So everyone, the entire atmosphere was very positive, and it was a time of growth. Then the second phase, which is the summer, the awakening. This is where the new system slowly but surely works, where you have a lot of prosperity, where you have increasing wealth, and where you can fix the inner system, so to say. And this was a time, or is typically a time, where inner conflicts come up, where the young generation tries to take over, the new generation tries to establish new values. And this is what we saw in the 60s to 80s with the civil rights movement, with the protests against the Vietnam War and stuff like that. Then you have the third turning, and this is the autumn. This is where the system is working, where you have a lot of prosperity, a lot of growth, the internal conflicts are resolved, and you're now more or less at the peak of the system. But slowly but surely, the system starts to erode again. So you have in this society a lot of individualism. You have, a lot of, focus on yourself rather than the system as a whole. And then in the fourth turning, this is the crisis. Then, old institutions start to lose their importance. New institutions come up, and, probably in most cases, a conflict arises that has to stop the old system and leads to a new cycle with a new system. And all these cycles can be characterized, and this is exactly what the book does. And I think, if you take a look at the history, and I did that based on, the experience that I had, also, with family members, and, talk to people, who have been part of these circles. And, it's quite accurate what this book is describing. And then the third concept that I want to talk about is the concept of generations. And this is also very important here. Because what it says is that, of course, throughout these cycles, you have different generations in different positions. So if we talk about generation, we always say, okay, you have the childhood. So this is where people, get born up until their 20s. Then entering young adulthood. So this is between the 20s and 40s. Then midlife is between the 40s and 60s. And then elderhood is between 60s and 80s. And what this book says is, and this is just generational theory, is that you have a generation that starts at one point and then, of course, evolves throughout these phases. And for example, you had the GI generation that, was born between, 1900 and then the 30s. And, this was the time where they were quite young. Then they were in their adulthood during the wars, or the World War II especially, and the Great Depression, and then evolved as entering midlife in the 50s. And these were actually the people who were part of the spring in the 60s, and then were in the elderhood in the 60s to 80s. And so you have generations. A generation is born at some time, and then of course evolves throughout the years. And here it's very important to understand, and I think, for me, this was quite useful because it really helped me to understand, okay, in what situation is my current generation. So I am a millennial, I'm born in the 90s. So I would be here, if we take a look at the example, here a millennial. And each generation, depending on what cycle we are, has a certain role. So the millennial generation is pretty similar, according to this book, to the GI generation. So they are the so-called heroes because they are the generation that are born shortly before a big crisis. Then they are in their young adulthood, so between the 20s and 40s, in that crisis. And this is exactly where I am now. And then, they evolve as midlifers after the crisis. And those are typically, the generations that, lead people through the crisis. And then they are also responsible for building the system after the crisis. And then, you have other generations as well. This is just my generation that I just highlighted. And I think this is really, really helpful to understand where we are and where we are going. So what is this book generally saying? We talked about the cycles, we talked about the characteristic of the cycles, we talked about generations. And as I said, if you watch the video, you're most likely a millennial. So you're born probably, in the late 80s or in the 90s. If you're even younger, then you might be another generation. But what we can say is that we are in the middle of a fourth turning. So this means basically that we are in a time of a crisis. And I think, it's quite obvious if we take a look at, the financial situation, the economic situation, if we take a look at the lockdowns, if we take a look at Ukraine war, if we take a look about rising conflicts between China and US, inner conflicts within the US. So this is quite obvious that we are in a crisis. The important thing to understand is that yes, there is a crisis, but also this is, just part of another cycle. So of course there is a crisis, and yes, no one knows how this ends, and we can make predictions about that. But the positive thing is that, after that, a new cycle starts. And if you're watching this video, chances are very, very high that yes, we will go through the crisis within the next years. but that we will also see the spring again. And this should be really encouraging, because this gives you the chance to use this crisis for yourself in order to build or to get through the crisis, position yourself so that you have a good positioning once this crisis is over, and then you can be part of this nice upcycle that we have in the new cycle when we see spring again. So these are some core concepts that I really liked about the book, that I really think are worth mentioning and explaining. So what did I think about the book? So basically there are some pros and some cons. So pros are, I think it's a really important book that helps you to understand cycles of generations. It also has great concepts that are very detailed, and explanations with very detailed explanations from history. So it's very detailed, gives you a very good understanding about also the past. And also I think it really helps to understand the current situation and where we are heading. What are the cons? I think it's quite old, so it was written in the 90s, so it doesn't cover the most recent events. But I just saw on Amazon that a new book from Howe is coming out in July 2023, so you should definitely check this out. And one negative aspect, that it's very history heavy, so it's not really written in an entertaining way. It's very, I would almost say, in academic language. It's very history heavy, but still the concepts are great. So what would I give this book? I would give it 4 from 5 stars. I think the core concepts are really great. So if you want to understand in what kind of situation we are, you definitely have to read it. I think it's very helpful. I have to deduct 1 star because of the style in which it's written. So for me, it's too academic. It's not really entertaining, but that's probably also not what the book intends. But that's why I only give 4 stars. But nevertheless, it's a recommendation that you definitely should read it. So, of course, I'm interested what you think about the book. Also, if you want to do me a book review about another book, then please write it in the comments below. With that being said, I wish you a lot of fun reading the book, and hope you have a wonderful day. Talk to you soon. Goodbye, Johannes.